Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services is set to launch a pilot project to assist detainees granted bail but cannot afford it. Over 2,600 prisoners awaiting a trial remain in overcrowded South African jails after failing to pay bail amounts under 1,000 rand, with many more struggling to pay higher amounts. For more on this, we are now joined by Justice Edwin Cameron, Inspecting Judge of the Correctional Services. Justice Cameron, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. What spurred on this idea to say that let's look at the number of trial-awaiting detainees who cannot afford to pay bail, even though that bail amount is set at around 1,000 rand and sometimes less?
Good morning, Aldrin, and good morning to all Newzroom Afrika's viewers. It's a great pleasure to be here. We had two reasons. The one is the complete injustice of keeping people in prison simply because they're poor. And 1,000 rand to many of us and many of your viewers seems a relatively small amount, but to most South Africans, it's a huge amount. And as you've just said, Aldrin, almost 3,000 people have been granted bail. And it's important to say that means that a judicial officer has checked that they've got an address, that they won't interfere with witnesses, that they won't be a danger to the administration of justice, and that they will stand trial. So all of that has been checked, and yet they end up in overcrowded, unsanitary cells awaiting trial for a long period. To us at the Judicial Inspectorate of Correctional Services, and to the people who are helping us and who spearheaded the feasibility study at the Bertha Institute at UCT, to us, that is a gross injustice. And the second reason, Aldrin, as you asked, is also because of overcrowding. We believe that we can make at least initially a marginal impact on the gross overcrowding that afflicts almost all our prisons in this country.
Yeah. Then how should we understand bail in our legal jurisprudence with the Criminal Justice Act as well, in the sense that when bail is granted, we always explain that there are bail conditions, and if you transgress those bail conditions, you would forfeit your bail as well. In this particular case, how then should we understand a bail that is actually funded by an external party for an individual who has been incarcerated?
It's a very good question, Aldrin. And remember that always you can get someone to pay your bail. Maybe it's your spouse or a friend or a relative, or maybe you take a loan to pay it. So we're not doing anything unusual. What we are doing is to stand in. Bail is an amount set to secure your attendance at trial. Yeah. And we are going to build into our pilot project various methods of nudging the persons whom we benefit from this fund to make sure that they do attend their trial, which is the purpose of bail, as you've just asked.
All right. Let's just quickly bring up a board now that looks at the various provinces that have these detainees, awaiting trial detainees who can afford or cannot afford 1,000 rand or less bail. In Gauteng, we have around 742. In the Western Cape, around 798. Are these the top two provinces when it comes to detainees who cannot afford bail that has been set at around 1,000 rand or less?
Precisely. And that is why we are thinking of having the pilot project in either Gauteng at the Johannesburg Correctional Centre, well known as Sun City, or at Pollsmoor, Wynberg Magistrates Court, Mitchell's Plain Magistrates Court, Goodwood Magistrates Court. And Pollsmoor is one of the most overcrowded remand centres anywhere in the country. So we're going to be doing that in the next few months.
And then from a cost perspective as well, if we look at the average that government spend on prisoners, we're going to see if we can bring up that board quickly. Last year, the question was asked to the Minister of Correctional Services about the amount average per capita that is spent on a prisoner. The average monthly cost per capita, as you can see, in January, it was around 13,255 rand a month. There we have April was perhaps the highest at 17,055 rand. But the inspectorate itself has told Parliament that it costs around 458 rand a day to accommodate a prisoner. Does this help in any way at all to deal with that particular cost?
I think so, Aldrin, and you're absolutely asking the right question. It doesn't make sense to to hold people in confined, unjust conditions when it's costing the state so much. We can make much better use of our allocation to the Department of Correctional Services, improving prisons by improving sanitary.
Sorry, Justice Cameron, we lost you there. Justice Cameron, if you can hear us. Okay, let's see if we can re-establish that line there to Justice Cameron there on this idea of having funding being put aside for people who can't afford the bail. Okay, Justice Cameron, we lost you there for a second. You were still explaining the cost of keeping a person incarcerated and juxtapose that to the bail amount.
Exactly. And the figure that we gave to Parliament, to the Correctional Services Committee some time ago, is quite outdated, as your figures have indicated, Aldrin. Your Newzroom Afrika's figures are better up to date, and the figures that we gave previously were too low. It's very expensive to keep a prisoner inside a prison, and we have to reconsider how we are spending our money in order to make us safe against particularly violent crime.
Do you see any potential legal hurdles here?
Not legal hurdles, but we emphasize that the bail fund is going to be outside existing institutions. It's not going to be run by the NPA. It's not going to be run by JICS or the Department of Correctional Services. It's not going to be run by any Department of Justice or other government department. Nevertheless, we badly need buy-in from the prosecution. We had Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions, Advocate Anton van Zyl, at our meeting last week. We had Acting Chief Magistrate of Randburg, Mr. Mamburu, at the meeting. We had judges, former judges like myself, Judge Lee Bozalek, Judge Richard Goldstone, and various people who indicated their support. So we hope we are going to get institutional support, but we are outside those existing. There's no legal impediment, but your question rightly implies, and I think the Newzroom Afrika's poll this morning rightly implies, that people will say, you know, why are you having sympathy with these people? You know, they must have done something if they inside jail, and that's not either fair or logical. You are presumed innocent, which is a presumption that does matter when you plan, and it might be your own nephew or brother or spouse who is being unjustly kept inside and who is eventually either discharged or found innocent. So for all of those reasons, we think that despite some possibility of public resistance, we should go ahead with this scheme.
Yeah. Anton du Plessis, actually, the Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions, is quoted here in the Ground Up report stating that where any bail amount is less than 1,000 rand, it's really incumbent on the prosecutors and our own policy to make sure that those people don't get stuck and remain in prison because they can't pay the bail. What role, other than this particular element around the funding, can the NPA then play to ensure that you don't have people who get stuck in prison and they have a bail amount that is 1,000 rand or less?
Well, prosecutors play a vitally important role because they get up, they make submissions, they seek to guide the court as to whether to grant the bail and on what conditions to grant the bail. So to have the buy-in from the NPA through Mr. Anton du Plessis is vitally important. And once prosecutors are on board with this, we believe that the number of people who are being detained at the moment, as you indicated, almost 3,000, will diminish. And then we also hope to expand the scheme beyond only 1,000 rand to beyond the pilot project at possibly Pollsmoor, Wynberg, Mitchell's Plain Magistrates Court. We hope to expand it. And then we will also ask the prosecution to assist. And of course, judicial officers. Most of the work in criminal cases is done by very hardworking magistrates who work in very uncongenial conditions. And we did have representation from the magistracy in the meeting last week.
Yeah, and as I was reading on this, and I was looking also at the example around the Malawi bail project as well that they have, but there's answered a different question, I think, with regards to access to legal representation, which our legal aid already does and deals with that aspect. But then there's another element, and that is after the person, the accused, gets this funding, let's say R1,000, and is now out on bail, isn't the other hurdle also whether or not the accused can afford to actually attend his trial, considering sometimes also how far some of these courts are from where the accused would be staying, or sometimes even the victims for that matter?
Very good point, Aldrin, because of course we are talking of people who cannot afford what to many of our viewers, as we said earlier, seems an insignificant amount, but of course isn't. And then, as you point out, you've got to get from where you live to the court. You've got to be sure. We hope to build in nudges and incentives, SMSs, possibly further assistance in the form of transport. We don't yet know how the pilot project is going to be colored in. What we wanted to do and what the meeting approved last week is at least to get going, at least to do something, see where we fall on flat on our faces, see where we succeed, see what works, what doesn't work. But you rightly ask that question because that should also be built into an ideally operating bail fund scheme.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much for your time. Truly appreciate it. That is Justice Edwin Cameron there on the bail fund for people who are arrested and granted bail of R1,000 or less but can't afford it. So far, we have close to 3,000 awaiting trial detainees who have been granted bail of R1,000 or less but can't afford it. So Justice Edwin Cameron on this project that they are trying to pilot.